Welcome to the Health Feeds Performance podcast, where we believe that whole body nourishment is a requisite for athletic success. I'm your host, Ian Craig from the Centre for Integrative Sports Nutrition, and today I'm talking to exercise physiologist and sports nutritionist Simone de Carmo, who's also course coordinator on our courses. The topic today is hypertrophy in a sport and exercise context. And hypertrophy tends to be associated with big muscles, sweaty gyms, big pots of protein powder. But there's a little bit more to it than that. So muscle growth and development is important for athletes of all types, not just strength and power athletes, and potentially for healthy aging as well. So let's talk to an expert. Simone was the co-author on the hypertrophy chapter in the textbook for integrative sport and exercise nutrition. So Simone, I know you've got plenty to say on this topic. Why don't you start by introducing yourself, say a bit about your background, and also why in particular are you interested in the topic of hypertrophy?
Okay, thanks Ian. So I'm Simone. I work with Ian very closely at the Centre of Integrative Sports Nutrition, but I also have my own side business as a self-employed sports nutritionist, and I am based at the University of Glasgow, where I do a few workshops with the club athletes that are based there and study there. So particularly netball, rugby, football. I also see individual athletes that approach me. So I've been doing that for about 6 years now. And alongside that, I also do some gym classes. I instruct some gym classes like Pilates and a strength-based class, which is probably my favorite, because one of the goals is trying to increase strength and hypertrophy for some of the individuals who are taking part in that class. And my interest in this subject basically stemmed from my own experiences. So I come from an athletics background, specifically sprinting, 100 meters, and then I progressed to 400 meters. And as part of my degree, so I studied physiology, sports science, and nutrition at Glasgow University, and it was an integrated master's, so a 5-year degree. And as part of my degree, I spent a year in South Africa at the Sports Science Institute, just doing some research, nutrition-related research, as well as some biomechanics. And when I was in South Africa, I found CrossFit, which I fell in love with. But I quickly, I realized that I wasn't very strong in the endurance type stuff or the gymnastic stuff, but I was very strong in the strength and power stuff. So then from CrossFit, I then went into powerlifting, which I competed in for about 2 years. And as part of my journey in powerlifting, I was trying to kind of support my muscle and grow my muscle as much as possible. And so I experimented a lot with training and nutrition. And that's kind of where my interest came from.
So do you tend to work more in the area of hypertrophy with the athletes you work with, or is it more a broad scope?
It's more of a broad scope. A lot of it is just educational stuff. So how to kind of support their performance and recovery, looking at pre, during, post nutrition. With hypertrophy stuff, it tends to be more regular gym goers that I see or that approach me, and especially older adults, because they realize the importance of retaining muscle mass as they age. So it tends to be a broad range of topics, but hypertrophy I definitely see it more in the older adults that approach me rather than the younger adults.
It's interesting. So we get people, lay individuals starting to recognize the importance of that. So there's so many different reasons that hypertrophy is really important. And one of them is the aesthetics. One of them is for sport and exercise, but one of them is for health and longevity. So we'll get into that a wee bit later, but can we start with kind of nuts and bolts of hypertrophy? What are the basics that we need to know? Is it just lifting big weights and eating protein, or is there a bit more to it than that?
There's a bit more to it than that. So obviously you mentioned with hypertrophy, we can kind of classify hypertrophy in two. So functional hypertrophy, where you are focusing on increasing the size and the number of muscle fibers, and it's all about increasing the muscle density and the strength. Whereas non-functional hypertrophy, it emphasizes muscle size, but without enhancing kind of the strength to size ratio or the power output of that muscle. So it's all about size and appearance, and we tend to see that more in bodybuilding, for example. Your functional hypertrophy, it's more in like gymnasts who are trying to kind of have some muscle, but not too much because they need that optimal power to weight ratio. And when it comes to hypertrophy, the key thing is there needs to be kind of recurrent periods of positive net protein balance. So what this means is our muscles are in a constant state of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And the muscle protein synthesis rates have to kind of exceed the breakdown rates over a long period of time. That's how hypertrophy kind of occurs. And both training and nutrition, specifically protein, are very potent modulators of muscle protein synthesis. Training being the key one. So if I have to give a percentage with training and nutrition, roughly about 80% is training, 20% is nutrition. So with training, obviously, it's very individual. Everyone responds differently to training. Some people respond very poorly to resistance training. And it's just finding what figures out what works for that person. So if you look at a specific, like a general textbook on resistance training, you'll probably find a general guidance of staying within a rep range of 6 to 12 reps. Now that is very generic. For example, I was gaining muscle and just training in a very low rep range with very high weights, whereas some people need to hit the higher rep range, like beyond the 12 reps, so maybe 20 up to 30 maybe, and it's all about volume. And with training, it's also important that there is progressive overload. So you're constantly stressing the muscles to adapt over time. And this can be done by slowly, gradually increasing rep range, sets, the frequency of training. For more advanced trainers, you can start bringing in certain techniques like drop sets, trisets, supersets, and so on. So that's training. I'd say as a good starting point, if it's a beginner, I'd say stick between 6 to 12 reps, maybe the higher end and lighter weights until you get used to the movements, and just see how the body adapts, basically. Nutrition-wise, obviously, hypertrophy is quite costly energetically. So it's normally advised that individuals go on a caloric surplus, especially athletes. Individuals who are complete beginners, who maybe carry a bit of maybe some fat mass, they can actually gain muscle even being in a caloric deficit because they have that extra energy storage to fuel the hypertrophic process. But for athletes specifically, you're looking at a caloric surplus, but conservative. So I would always start maybe 250 calories above their maintenance calories, and see how they adapt over time. For beginners or more unconditioned athletes potentially, and you're wanting to kind of get them to restore their muscle mass, you can probably go a little bit higher, maybe to 500, and see how they adapt. So then after calories, you're then looking at protein. Protein being the key macronutrient because it provides all the amino acids to build muscle. And if I had to kind of give some general guidance around protein, I kind of demonstrate this pyramid to my clients. So at the base of the pyramid, we have total protein intake of most importance, followed by protein quality, and then timing and distribution. And then at the tip of the pyramid, supplementation. But supplementation, it's always a question mark because it's not always needed. It really depends on the athlete's goal. Now, when it comes to total protein intake, there was a key study by Morton et al. In 2018. And it was a meta-analysis, and it included over 40 studies with over 700 of young and old participants. And they were looking at fat-free mass, changes in free fat mass. So if you imagine a graph with on the y-axis, we have changes in free fat mass, and on the x-axis we have the protein intake, daily protein intake, and it was quite a wide range. And they were looking for that optimal amount where they're doing this regression analysis, and they're looking for that point where it kind of just plateaus. And they found that point was at 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight of protein intake per day. Anything beyond that, there was no added benefit of consuming more protein. Now, obviously, this is an average, and science looks at averages. I found in my practice, I had to go beyond that value to see any benefits. And that can come down to an athlete's digestive capabilities, especially if they're on a more like a vegetarian vegan diet. Also due to just individual genetics. So it's just finding that value that works for that specific individual. But 1.6 is a good starting point, I'd say. So after total protein intake, you're then looking at protein quality. Now, in the conventional sports nutrition research, when we're looking at protein quality, we're looking basically what will provide the best anabolic stimulus. And when they're looking at protein quality, they're really considering the amino acids, and specifically leucine being the key one, which will trigger a pathway called the mTOR C1 pathway. And that's the key kind of anabolic pathway. So the advice is basically making sure that an athlete has enough foods in their diet that contains high amounts of leucine. But if we think more integratively, in terms of quality, I also consider, especially if an athlete is on eating animal-based foods and animal-based proteins, where is the animal coming from and how the animal was raised? Because there's a lot of research showing that, for example, animals that came from conventional farming versus grass-fed practices, the grass-fed animals tend to have, for example, better lipid profiles, more omega-3s. And if you think about athletes, we do want to kind of modulate their inflammation, and omega-3s do kind of support that. So it's kind of thinking beyond the amino acids, but also the quality of the food that they're eating.
Okay, so you've said a lot there, Simone, to get us started, which has raised a few questions for me. You mentioned something about raising muscle cell size and also number. So that comes back to an old kind of discussion in the literature, which I haven't visited for a long time, which is hypertrophy versus hyperplasia. And hyperplasia was the increase of number cells. So what's going on in the literature there at the moment? Are they starting to discover that you can actually increase muscle number as well as size?
I think a lot of I haven't seen any recent research on it, to be honest, but I think a lot of the research that looks into hyperplasia, it's all indirect research, so looking at animals, for example, animal models. But if we look at bodybuilders, for example, and the amount of muscle mass that they have, I do believe that there has to be an increase in the number of muscle fibers just to get that kind of size, as well as the size of the individual muscle fibers themselves. It's not very ethical to kind of cut someone's muscle and kind of count the number of individual fibers that they have. So yeah, I don't know of any recent research on the topic. I haven't actually explored it, to be honest, lately. But yeah, it is a debate, an ongoing debate in the field.
Yeah, it's one of those philosophical debates, but at the end of the day, it's working with that person in front of you, trying to increase their muscle size and strength or whatever their goal is. You talked about genetics there in terms of the way you train people. So if you go into, as you said, a standard textbook, 6 to 12 range is pretty, 6 to 12 rep range is pretty typical for hypertrophy. And then when you're going lower than that, it's more of a strength focus. But you and many other actual practitioners working with people have said, well, yeah, it depends. It depends on the person. How do you figure out, if you get somebody in front of you, say they're a new client, their key goal is hypertrophy, how do you figure out whether you need to be dropping them down lower than that fairly quickly or pushing them up to higher reps? Like, some people do 20 reps in a set.
So first, it depends where the client is at. If they're like a complete beginner, but if they're more like intermediate and they've been trying it for, let's say, a year and a half of training, and they've reached this kind of plateau, in most cases they would have stayed within that range, 6 to 12 reps. I would probably start increasing the reps, just because from a safety point of view. If we kind of go lower in the reps, and you go more into the powerlifting realm, it can be effective, obviously, but it is a bit more, maybe the client might not feel as comfortable doing that because it is heavier weights. So I would probably go higher in reps and see how the client responds. And then maybe incorporating some more advanced techniques, which can be very effective for hypertrophy. So like incorporating maybe pyramids or drop sets or trisets, and just increasing the overall intensity. Because I find a lot of clients who've been trying to gain muscle and they've reached this plateau, they're not getting enough intensity in their workouts. So just by increasing the intensity and maintaining consistency is really important.
I think that's a really key last point. People actually have to work hard enough, and they can hit this plateau quite easily and then not push themselves beyond that. So I've heard lactate's quite a good signaling mechanism for muscle hypertrophy. You're nodding your head, so that must be right.
So just coming back to the intensity part, a way I try and engage it is I want them to kind of, with each set, I want them to be able to get to the point where they have 1 to 2 reps in reserve per set. That's the kind of intensity. And that tends to work for most people. And even within the intensity, even if the client comes to me just looking for resistance training advice, I'm always asking them questions about their nutrition, because they need to ensure that they're having enough nutrition and energy to support the intensity of their training. And a lot of them don't. They come into their training sessions fasted or having the last meal, let's say 3 hours before, and they only want to bring water in during the workout, whereas it can be quite effective having something like a DIY sports drink just to kind of provide that extra energy to support the intensity.
So I want to go into nutrition a wee bit more in a minute, but I'm quite curious because something's happened over the last maybe 10 plus years with the culture of people coming into the gyms. It used to be people would come in with a commercial sports drink, which might be brightly coloured and full of rubbish, but it gave them some sugar at least. But there's a lot of fasted workouts and water-only workouts going on. Have you got any kind of insights as to cultures and trends around that?
Yeah, I definitely see people going in fasted, And I try to explain to them how it's actually detrimental to what they're trying to do in the gym. And especially those that go early in the morning, they always have this excuse that they wake up early and they're not hungry, so they'll just go and train and then they'll eat afterwards. In general, I'd say you can do that if it's a very low intensity session and you're not really pushing it. You could probably do that. But if you're pushing the intensity, plus you're a very stressed person, you have a very high life load, I would, even if it's just a banana, eat a banana before you go in, or just bring in a DIY sports drink before you come in to kind of help provide the energy, but also modulate cortisol levels. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. Is there anything specific?
No, that's fine. I think it's just to emphasize the importance. Like I keep coming back to this James Morton quote. Sorry, it was Sam Impey and James Morton from Liverpool. Fuel for the work required. I think it's just the phrase can be implied in a lot of places, and we need to be fed sufficiently for what we're trying to do. So you talked earlier about calorie excess. If somebody has a hypertrophy goal, it kind of makes sense. You also said something that if somebody's holding on to body fat, they do actually have some energy available to even cope in a calorie deficit, which is quite an interesting observation, but it makes sense. So say somebody's quite lean, they're wanting to gain, you put them in a calorie excess. How do you figure that out? Because the calorie field's kind of fraught with errors. How do you get a gauge with your one individual client, whether they're in an excess or a deficit?
Okay, so as part of my consultation process, I do, if it's appropriate for the client and they don't display any signs of disordered eating, I'll ask them to do a food diary. Obviously, food diaries aren't very reliable, but we can get a kind of an estimate of how much they're eating. From that food diary, I then do a quantitative analysis to get calorie data, but as well as macronutrient data, as well as their micronutrients in terms of their intake. And then from that, I kind of get an estimate of their calorie intake. Obviously, again, might not be very accurate. There could be underreporting going on with the food diary. If they're like describing a food, let's say a medium apple, their thoughts of a medium apple could be different to mine. So the way I try and minimize the error with that is I ask them to take photos of their meals, just so I can kind of get an idea of where and correlate with their food diary if it's making sense. So from that, I get an idea, an estimate of their calorie intake, and obviously their target calories. I use well-established equations to kind of calculate that, but even with that, again, it's very generic. So it's just to really get an idea, and from that, depending where they're at, let's say they're close to their maintenance calories, I then suggest a conservative increase in their calories, roughly around 250, let's say for about 2 weeks, and see how they get on. I don't want to go too much. A lot of practitioners might start even above 250, but I also want the athletes or the individuals to get used to the increase in food. So I like to do it more gradually. And it's a learning process for the athlete as well as myself, because there's ongoing feedback. They're constantly sending me what they're eating and pictures of their meals, and I'm giving them ongoing feedback of how to kind of optimize it. To kind of track their whether they're gaining muscle mass. I tend to depending on the client and whether it's appropriate, we can use skin folds. And I might do that not every 2 weeks, but I might do it, let's say, every 6 weeks for the client. For clients who I don't think it's appropriate to use skin folds, and if they feel it's okay for them, might use just photos, because it's a good way to kind of see body composition changes. And then also girth measurements, so bicep girth, quad girth, to see if they're kind of increasing in size. So these are just different ways of kind of monitoring the athlete's progress.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of tracking and quite a few variables coming in there. So you're not just relying on an app to tell you, that you get so many calories in and out. You're also trained for skin folds through Isaac, aren't you, Simone? So do you want to just mention that and the importance of accuracy?
So basically, they teach us a standardized way of doing skin folds. So we train to kind of identify the different anatomical points, and then from there take a skin fold measure. And there's a specific way of doing it, like how to pinch the skin, and where to take the skin fold. So it's roughly around, I think it's 1 centimeter below where you pinch. And making sure you're not holding the caliper more than 2-3 seconds. So it's just little things like that can make a big difference. So yeah, there's specific sites that we do for skin folds, but we also take some girth measurements as well as part of the whole profile, the Isaac profile.
Okay, thanks, Simone. Let's go into mTOR, because anything hypertrophy, you're gonna come across the term mTOR. You mentioned it earlier. Can you extend into it a little bit more in the different types of mTOR and what they actually mean?
Okay, so mTOR is basically a complex, and it stands for the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So rapamycin is a drug, and it used to be used a lot for organ transplants. But up until recently, there was an article that came out, if I'm not mistaken, in the New Scientist magazine, where they were describing rapamycin as an anti-aging drug. But it's a very powerful drug because it does kind of block mTOR. Now, mTOR kind of consists of 2 subdomains, so 2 complexes, mTOR C1, mTOR C2. Your mTOR C1 responds to things like nutrients, the energy status of the cell, growth factors. And once it's activated, it will kind of phosphorylate or activate downstream targets, which would then translate into protein synthesis. So mTOR C1 is all about the growth of the cell, growth of the muscles. Your mTOR C2 mainly responds to growth factors. It's less sensitive to nutrients, and it's more to do with the stability of the cell and the resilience. So when we're talking about hypertrophy and all the literature on hypertrophy, it's mainly focused on mTOR C1.
Okay, so if you stay within the hypertrophy literature, you're talking about mTOR or mTOR C1 specifically. If you delve into the anti-aging or the longevity literature nowadays, which is becoming more and more common, there must be more aging researchers out there or something, but it's become a big research interest. mTOR has kind of become the baddie, and then AMPK is the goodie. If you're stimulating AMPK, you're going to live a long, healthy life. If you're stimulating mTOR, you're going to die soon with a horrible disease. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because it doesn't really make too much sense in the balance of the human physiology.
It's quite a complex topic, so I'll try my best. Obviously, all the anti-aging stuff, first, it's not really they're not looking at from an athletic point of view, in an athlete's population. So that's something to be mindful of. But basically what kind of research is telling us is that too much mTOR activation or hyperactivation can speed up aging. And so things that can kind of cause this hyperactivation are too much glucose or too much insulin, a hypercaloric diet for a long period of time, chronic protein intakes, sedentary patterns, things like this can kind of contribute towards this mTOR C1 activation, as well as stress. Chronic stress can also contribute towards it. When I say stress, I mean cortisol. Chronic cortisol elevations can contribute towards this mTOR C1 activation. AMPK is all about when energy levels are kind of low in the body, when we're exercising, so endurance exercise as well as resistance exercise, AMPK is activated, or when there's low glucose availability. So it's kind of a sensor, an energy sensor of the cell. And it promotes the breakdown or catabolism to generate energy, which then also it also enhances the recycling of cells. So autophagy is the term. And when AMPK is activated, it then suppresses mTOR C1. So it's kind of this seesaw. They both have opposing roles. But when mTOR C1 is hyperactivated, and it has been linked to things like increased cancer, it speeds up aging, and it's linked to age-related diseases like Alzheimer's. And high mTOR C1 has also been linked to inflammation. It drives a lot of inflammatory molecules. So, and we know with chronic inflammation that can damage tissues, and it can contribute to certain conditions like heart disease, arthritis, as well as some neurodegenerative diseases. So it's a complex topic. It's hard to kind of say how much mTOR, how much of mTOR when we activate it, like how much is too much. Same with AMPK. It's also not good to be in a constant state of AMPK activation, so in a constant state of low energy availability, low calorie diet for a long period of time, because you want to support the growth and the replication of new cells as well. So it's just finding the balance. Being mindful that kind of research is looking at the non-athlete person.
I think you did that really well. That was a very nice balanced view of the AMPK mTOR seesaw, and that's important to always view. It's just, the two metabolic systems that need to be in relative balance most of the time, but in some cases we need to flip one way, say during a calorie deficit or a metabolic stress situation, and then other times we need to flip the other way to recover and restore. So it should always be this action and not a seesaw that gets stuck on one side. You were talking about leucine earlier. So leucine is one of the branched chain amino acids. So we used to talk a lot about branched chain amino acids, and every person with hypertrophy goals would be taking BCAAs in addition to their, as part of their supplement regime. The current research is more around leucine specifically, and the leucine trigger of mTOR and muscle protein synthesis. Do the other ones not matter so much? So that's part one of my question. So leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And the second part is, should we be supplementing leucine, or is the food approach enough?
So branched chain amino acids were very popular, but the research kind of tells us now that it can just be a waste of money. So even though we can take in branched chain amino acids and they can kind of turn on mTOR, if there's no other amino acids in the system, it's not going to translate into protein synthesis, because we need the other building blocks to kind of synthesize new protein. So instead of spending money on BCAAs, you might as well just take a good quality waste supplement, for example, or good plant-based protein supplement if you're a plant-based athlete. In terms of supplementing with leucine, for most individuals, a food first approach is enough, making sure you're getting enough leucine-rich foods in your diet. So that's your meat, poultry, eggs, cottage cheese are good sources, animal-based sources. For plant-based sources, you're looking at hemp seeds, spirulina, and some pulses like lentils. So these are good plant-based sources. That said, as we age, we know we become a bit more resistant to anabolic stimuli, so like training, protein. So supplementing with leucine in these cases might be beneficial just to kind of help turn on the mTOR C1 pathway. And then just making sure that that athlete has enough protein from food to kind of provide all the other amino acids.
Thanks, Simone. I think that described it pretty well. What about vegetarian and more so vegan athletes? So vegetarian athletes, at least they've got the whole dairy family to pull from, which can be a very good source of protein, including your whey products. For a vegan athlete, it's obviously a lot more challenging. And I know that's an interest area of yours. So what are your kind of recommendations and things you look out for if you're working with a vegan athlete?
So I'm based in Glasgow. In Glasgow, there are a lot of vegans, so I do come across them quite often. I will say, in many cases, I have suggested these vegan athletes to incorporate some animal-based protein in their diet, so still remain plant-based, but if they really want to push their limits in terms of hypertrophy and performance, then bringing in some animal-based foods and specific ones just to kind of support those goals. There have been vegan athletes where they came to me and they were really struggling, but just helping them in terms of their planning of their diets, they were able to succeed and see changes. So again, I think it's just down to genetics, digestive capabilities. So plant-based foods can be a bit more tough to digest. It takes a bit more energy. So again, yeah, it's finding what works for the person. And I do believe vegan diets isn't for everyone. And sometimes it's hard to kind of change beliefs around that. Vegan athletes and those who can succeed on a very well-planned diet, we can support hypertrophy as long as they're getting enough protein throughout the day. And usually that tends to be more than the 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, just because plant-based sources, again, are tougher to digest. We might not absorb as many amino acids from plant-based foods as effectively as from compared to animal-based sources. They're less bioavailable. So yeah, making sure they're getting enough in terms of total protein intake from plant-based sources. Yeah, so the vegan athletes that succeed on a vegan diet, they can support hypertrophy as long as they're getting enough total protein intake a day. So, and it tends to be beyond that 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, just because plant-based proteins, the amino acids can be less bioavailable and it's tougher to digest these plant-based proteins. So it tends to be higher than that 1.6 value, but also making sure that the athlete is getting a variety of these plant-based sources, because plant-based foods, most of them tend to lack in one or two of the essential amino acids. So for example, pulses and legumes, they tend to lack in threonine and tryptophan. But just making sure that the athlete's consuming a variety will ensure that they're getting all of these essential amino acids in their diet. And a lot of the research shows that as long as they're getting it throughout the day, this variety, that's enough. I like to use every meal as an opportunity to make sure that they're getting enough.
Okay, so that's really, really helpful for the vegan athletes. I'm going to flip you on the other side and talk about overconsumption and maybe even overconsumption of animal proteins. So a case that seems to keep coming up again and again with me and colleagues are young rugby players. So teenage male or it could be female, but it's more male I've heard about. Rugby players, obviously, with a big ego, they want to gain the mass sufficiently to transition into senior rugby when they're, maybe 18, 19. And they're eating a lot of protein, including obviously protein powders and so on. What potential health risk can they do if they're over consuming protein?
Again, I think each individual will respond differently, but if it is an individual athlete that is just over consuming animal-based protein and is not getting any plant-based foods in their diet, then they potentially run the risk of chronic inflammation. Okay, and we know that chronic inflammation over time in the long run can cause a lot of issues in tissues and increase the risk of certain conditions, so like heart disease, for example, arthritis, as well as certain autoimmune conditions as well. And if there's not enough plant-based foods in their diet, they're also not getting all the beneficial antioxidants. And we need antioxidants to kind of neutralize all the oxidative stress that we generate from training. So these are just some of the two main things that I would say could potentially happen. Now, again, it depends on the quality of the animal-based foods. That could be a whole debate, where if it's good quality, grass-fed animal protein, I'd say it's pretty good. But if they're only consuming that, then I would like to see a bit more balance in their diets, a bit more plant-based foods as well, to kind of provide all the other benefits with the antioxidants as well as all the micronutrients.
I'll also throw in the urea cycle, which is a little biochemical loop most people aren't aware of, and it's linked to detoxification. So excess amino acids in the circulation can be broken down into urea and come out as urine ultimately. And if you've got enough micronutrition building blocks, it should all work perfectly well. But it's energy dependent, just like the whole of our detoxification system. So by having more than they need, they're expending extra energy to just clear out the excess. I want to take you to digestion, Simone, because you've talked quite a lot about that. And this might pertain to some hard gainers as well. So the phrase used for people that struggle to put muscle on easily. Do you have kind of suggestions or strategies that you use when you realize somebody's digestion struggling a little bit with having that excess, getting in the excess calories? Could be somebody who's having more plant-based sources of protein and they're struggling to break it all down and assimilate it. What are you thinking about on a case-by-case basis?
It's a very good question, quite a complex one. First, with any client, I would look at the way they're eating. So just making sure that they're chewing their food properly and eating a bit more mindfully can be a major kind of lever of change. I find that a lot of athletes are just constantly eating on the go and they're not really chewing their food properly, which means the digestive system is going to take a bit more energy and effort to kind of digest these foods. So just by changing the way they're eating can be really helpful. Then when we're looking at the digestive system, we really also need to look at the balance between their training and their recovery. If they're doing too much training, that's too much sympathetic activation. There's not enough parasympathetic activation, and we need that to kind of let our guts digest our food. So if they're constantly training and in a stress state with work or university and relationships and so on, and they're not taking time to kind of rest and recover, that can have an impact as well. With vegan athletes, what also makes a difference is, again, how are they consuming these foods in terms of their cooking methods. So things like making sure that they're cooking their pulses correctly, or they're they're roasting their nuts, it makes it easier for our digestive system to kind of cope with and extract the nutrition from these sources. Yeah, I think those are three key main things I would consider.
That's great, thank you. And also that's a domain that isn't really found in the hypertrophy literature per se, but when you're actually dealing with one person, it often becomes really, really important. And talking about, cooking your pulses and roasting your nuts and so on, I'm planning to do a podcast with my wife, Rachel Jessen, and she'll talk about this sort of stuff as well. You need to source good food, but then the actual preparation, how you put it together ready for eating is vitally important for nutrient availability.
I will add, there was a key study just to kind of showcase the importance of chewing the food properly. There was a study done, I can't remember the name of the author, but there was a study looking at older subjects, and they had, one group had their normal teeth, which was linked with better chewing efficiency, and another group had their dentures, which was correlated with a poor chewing efficiency. And they found that the group with their normal teeth, with a better efficiency, chewing efficiency, they showed a greater increase in plasma leucine levels from chewing, I think it was like 120 grams of meat, which then translated into better whole protein metabolism. Now, they weren't looking at muscle specifically, but if we're increasing whole protein metabolism, that tends to correlate with muscle protein synthesis. So it just kind of illustrates the importance of how chewing our food properly can translate into gains as well.
So that's a really good example of contextualizing research, because you're not necessarily dealing with older folk with dentures, but just the realization that how well we chew our food can affect our muscle protein synthesis is really, really quite key. Okay, so talking about digestion, I think it's a good transition into what's been called the gut-muscle axis, which you've paid a lot of attention to over the last couple of years. Can you tell us what on earth is the gut-muscle axis, and why is it important in this discussion of hypertrophy?
Okay, so it's quite a recent topic in terms of the literature, but it's a very exciting one. So we've all kind of heard of the gut-brain axis, and that's that bidirectional relationship between our guts and our gut microbiota, so our gut bacteria, and our brain, central nervous system, which kind of regulates our mood and stress-related responses. So that's the gut-brain axis. Now, the gut-muscle axis, again, is that bidirectional relationship between our gut microbiota and muscle function. And basically, an athlete could be having enough protein in their diet, a well-balanced diet, but if they have dysbiosis, which is an imbalance between the good and the bad bacteria, as well as intestinal permeability, so that's when the gut cell wall kind of becomes leaky, that can cause negative downstream effects on our skeletal muscle. So even overtraining or training too much and not managing recovery can also contribute to dysbiosis and intestinal permeability. And what can happen is all the protein that we consume, even though we can have enough amino acids in our system, the bioavailability of the amino acids are going to be compromised because of this dysbiosis and intestinal permeability. Likewise, our bacteria synthesize really important vitamins like folate, for example, which is an important cofactor in the Krebs cycle to generate ATP. So if you're not synthesizing enough of these vitamins, it can compromise the athlete's ability to generate energy and push the intensity in the gym, in their workouts. There's also a process called biotransformation of polyphenols that occurs in our gut. So basically they just become active, and that can be compromised again. So which means, again, the athletes will not be able to kind of neutralize all the oxidative stress that's generated from their training. So these are just some of the things that can happen if there's gut dysbiosis present and intestinal permeability. As well as if an athlete is not getting enough fiber in their diet, it can really compromise the synthesis of, the generation of the short chain fatty acids. So our gut bacteria, they kind of ferment on the fiber to generate these short chain fatty acids, which have a whole host of beneficial effects and metabolic effects, but can also benefit the muscle itself. So these are just some of the things that can happen. We obviously need more research in humans to kind of get to more conclusions. But it is a very exciting area of research.
So it's obviously something you're very aware of. So when you're working with your clients, do you introduce more prebiotic fibers into their diet if they're not consuming enough? And what about probiotics as well?
Yeah, so like I said, with the rugby player who was just eating animal-based foods, that's where some plant-based foods can be beneficial. Just again, upping the fiber intake to generate these short-chain fatty acids, making sure they're getting enough prebiotics. Probiotics, I like to rely on, again, a food-based approach. So things like, instead of making this smoothie with just a general whole milk, they could make it with kefir or kefir, for example, which is fermented milk, or incorporating a bit more natural yogurt in their diet, swapping their bread for a nice sourdough bread, or learning how to make sourdough bread can also be another option. And then a nice easy one is a tablespoon of sauerkraut daily, like a natural probiotic. I will sometimes advise supplemental probiotics, especially during periods maybe when they're traveling, when there's lots of travel involved, or when they're maybe in a calorie deficit for a short period of time under a lot of stress, because they need to make weight for a competition, or they're doing a bodybuilding show. I might bring in some probiotics then. But it's not something I would do long term in terms of supplemental probiotics.
So you're in a situation where you work with a lot of student athletes, and therefore finances you need to be quite sensitive about. So you've given some really good examples where you've gone food first. Are there some key supplements that you would maybe consider in many cases though?
I think 3 key supplements. If an athlete is struggling to really meet their protein needs through food, because we know protein is quite satiating, so some can be quite sensitive to that. So adding a bit of maybe a bit of supplemental protein powder, but just 1 scoop a day. I don't want them to rely on it as a way to get their protein. Can be really beneficial. A good quality whey protein supplement or a good quality plant-based blend can be quite useful. I always like to go for supplements that aren't flavored, minimal additives as possible, so they can just mix it in anything really. They can mix it in their porridge, in a smoothie, in their yogurt. Obviously, if I'm working with a competitive athlete that competes for a club, I need to ensure that it is Informed Sport approved or batch tested, like with any supplement. Another key supplement, there's lots of research behind it, but also a lot of misconceptions behind it, is creatine. Creatine not everyone responds to it, so it doesn't work for everyone, but when it does, it can be powerful. It's shown to increase strength, power output, and support muscle gains. People who tend to respond to it very well are vegans or vegetarians who don't get enough animal-based foods and meat in their diet. That's where we get creatine from. Creatine is also really beneficial for athletes that are competing in sports where there is an increased risk of concussions. So if they do get a concussion, it's something I would recommend in their recovery. Then the last one would be caffeine. Just a good old caffeine double espresso before training. Caffeine kind of binds to the adenosine receptor in the brain. So adenosine is what makes us feel sleepy. Caffeine is an antagonist to that, and it makes us feel more alert, which means we can push the intensity with our training. Again, caffeine doesn't work for everyone. Some athletes find it actually makes them very anxious and jittery, and that can actually become detrimental in terms of their performance. So it doesn't work for everyone, but when it does, it is powerful. Some other supplements that I might consider, omega-3s. We do need more research on it, but the research that is out there, it has shown that it can potentially increase the sensitivity of the mTOR C1 pathway, especially in older adults. And it's shown in older adults to kind of reduce neuromuscular fatigue as well. And then lastly, maybe beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is just kind of a buffer. So it's really useful for when we're really pushing intensity. But it comes with a side effect of tingling. But to kind of counteract that, I would just make sure that the athlete's taking it in a split dose regime. So these are just some of the supplements I would consider. But yeah, it doesn't tend to be a focus of mine until we've really nailed down the nutrition, the food side first.
Great, thanks, Simone. An hour has flown past. I think we could quite easily extend this subject to another hour. But before we finish, if people want to connect with you, where are good places to find you?
So I am on Twitter or X. So my handle is @sport_bookie. So BOKKIE stands for the Springboks, the South Africa rugby team. I'm on Twitter. I'm on the Center of Integrative Sports Nutrition website. You can find me there. And then I also have my personal website, which is pb-nutrition.com.
Thanks, Simone. It's been a pleasure as usual.
Thank you, Ian.
I really appreciate the generous input of Simone and all my other guests on the Health Feeds Performance podcast. To view some of my other interviews, subscribe to our YouTube channel or check us out on the main podcast channels. I'm also really keen to find out what you would like to see in the future. So please go onto our website, intsportsnutrition.com, and send us a message through the contact page. And while you're on there, have a little look at all the courses that we run. So until next time, bye for now.